The ramp at Normandy, June 6, 1944. At dawn on June 6, 1944, somewhere off the coast of Normandy, the English Channel heaving under a low grey sky, a young infantryman in a steel M1 helmet crouches shoulder to shoulder with 35 others inside a plywood and steel box that smells of diesel, wet canvas, and cold fear. The craft bucks as it clears the shadow of the troopship. Spray slaps the bow and runs in thin sheets across the deck, soaking boots and leggings. The coxswain, hands white-knuckled on the wheel, keeps the nose pointed into the chop, while the engineer works the throttle by feel, listening to the engine note the way a farmer listens to weather. Around them, the sea is alive with silhouettes. Destroyers throwing flashes on the horizon, landing craft in staggered lines, and the dark blurs of barrage balloons beyond the smoke. The soldiers don't talk much now. They can't hear each other anyway. Not over the engine, not over the artillery, not over the metallic rattle of gear as the boat slams down and rises again. Someone grips an M1 Garand so tight his knuckles look bone white. Another man checks the strap on a Bangalore torpedo and then stops, because there's nothing left to do but wait for the sand. The coxswain glances left, briefly, at the wake of another identical craft, then forward again. Ahead is a strip of beach that has been turned into a machine, obstacles planted like crooked teeth, mines, barbed wire, and gun emplacements aimed at the waterline. This boat isn't armored, it isn't fast, it isn't graceful, but it does one thing with brutal clarity. It gets men from ship to shore, and it does it under fire. The infantryman feels the boat's flat bottom begin to skim, drafting shallow, then the jolt as it grinds into sand. The engine rises, then drops as the coxswain eases it back. The bowman moves, reaching for the mechanism. A heartbeat later, the ramp crashes down, a blunt metal slap against the beach, and the world outside becomes a screaming wall of sand and bullets. Men surge forward in a single reflex, boots pounding the ramp, bodies spilling into surf that turns instantly violent, some stumbling, some falling, some disappearing in the foam. For a few seconds, the boat is a doorway between two realities. Behind it, the massed machinery of the fleet. In front of it, the raw, murderous geometry of the Atlantic Wall. And in that narrow doorway sits an invention born thousands of miles away from Normandy, not in a naval design bureau, not in a marble headquarters, but in the heat and clang of New Orleans, where a hard-eyed boat builder named Andrew Jackson Higgins had spent years shaping shallow draft hulls for swamps and marshes, then convincing the military that an ugly, practical craft with a drop-down ramp could change what was possible in war. More than 23,000 of these landing craft, vehicle, personnel, LCVPs, would be built. A number so large it becomes invisible until you picture this single moment repeating again and again across oceans. Hull to sand, ramp to beach, men into history. The ramp is still dropping somewhere on a French beach, but the story yanks hard on its own thread and snaps back 3 years and an ocean away to New Orleans, May 26, 1941, where the air tastes like brackish water and machine oil, and the shoreline of Lake Pontchartrain shimmers under a pale southern sun. Andrew Jackson Higgins stands with his sleeves rolled and his jaw set, watching his men push a squat, flat-bottomed craft into the water as if they're launching a dare. Higgins is not a naval architect with polished shoes. He's a bruiser entrepreneur who learned boats the way the Gulf learned storms, by surviving them. His Eureka workboats were built to run shallow, nose into mud, and back out again without losing a propeller, exactly the kind of stubborn, practical behavior an amphibious assault demands when there is no pier, no harbor, no mercy. On the shore, Navy and Marine observers, Commander Ross Daggett from the Bureau of Ships, and Major Ernest Linsert from the Marine Corps equipment world, watch with clipboards and skepticism, because the Marines have a problem that kills men. Earlier troop boats force soldiers to climb over the sides to get out, turning the boat itself into a trap the moment bullets start snapping across the surf. Higgins' answer today is brutally simple. Cut the bow open, hang a steel ramp on the front, and let a whole platoon, 36 men, pour forward in one surge instead of spilling out piecemeal over the gunwales. The engine chatters, the coxswain swings the nose in, the hull skims into water so thin it looks like it shouldn't float at all, and then the craft drives straight up toward the shoreline, the spoon-shaped bow and shallow draft doing what Higgins always bragged his boats could do: land where other boats hesitate. On signal, the ramp drops. A truck rolls off in a shuddering lurch. Higgins' employees, playing troops, run down the ramp and scatter, then pile back in, again and again, rehearsing the exact rhythm that will one day repeat under real fire. Somewhere behind all this is an image that helped ignite the ramp idea in the first place. Marine officer Victor Brute Krulak had seen evidence of Japanese landing craft with a retractable bow ramp during the 1937 fighting in China and pressed Higgins toward the concept. Higgins, at his own expense, adapts it, builds prototypes, and drags the Navy into watching the proof rather than debating it. In the span of minutes on Pontchartrain's edge, a theory becomes a mechanism. Front ramp for fast egress, protected propeller system, and semi-tunnel hull features to keep moving in the shallows, plywood sides to save weight and scarce steel, and a production-minded layout that hints at the real miracle to come. Not one boat, but thousands. The observers don't need poetry. They need numbers, speed, repeatability. Higgins gives them the sight of a beach landing that doesn't require a port. And in that moment, the war's future geography quietly expands. Because if you can land over an open beach, you can strike where the enemy least expects. The lake water is still dripping off the ramp hinges when the calendar lurches forward. And on December 8, 1941, New Orleans wakes into a different war, one where contracts are not debated, they are demanded. In Higgins' yards, the morning air carries a sharp bite of winter through the Gulf humidity, and the first thing men notice is the sound. Radios turned up in offices and tool rooms, voices urgent, names and places punching through static, Pearl Harbor, battleships, fire, a nation suddenly in uniform. Andrew Higgins moves through the plant like he's been wound tighter than the springs in his own ramp mechanism. He's not giving speeches, he's pointing. At hulls on skids, at stacks of plywood, at engine mounts, at the bow where men will die if the exit is wrong. By midday, he's already acting as if time itself is an enemy combatant. And while Washington argues over procurement pathways, Higgins behaves like the order has been placed. On paper, he pushes to lock down what matters, filing for the ramped landing craft patent the day after the attack, as if he can nail the design to the deck before the bureaucracy can drift away from it. In the shops, the war becomes an assembly rhythm, measuring jigs clamped down, templates hung on posts, bulkheads cut and stacked, frames aligned until the hull shape repeats with machine regularity. The craft is blunt and purposeful, about 36 feet long, shallow draft, open-topped, with a bow that isn't meant to slice water so much as to survive the last 50 yards to sand. And Higgins' men work the boat like a promise that can be counted. A foreman barks over the whine of saws. Rivet guns chatter like distant small arms. Welders throw blue-white light that stings the eyes. The smell of hot metal and fuel mixes with river air. Higgins' gamble is not only a design, it's scale. He expands hard, fast, pulling in workers by the thousands until the yards feel like a city inside the city, with multiple plants feeding the same hunger for hulls, ramps, and engines. The workforce becomes something New Orleans hasn't seen before in an industrial space, diverse and integrated by policy, because Higgins is trying to win a race that does not pause for prejudice, and he needs hands more than he needs permission. Somewhere on a wall, a slogan dares any man to slow down. Somewhere on a bench, a bow ramp is fitted and refitted until it drops clean and rises clean, over and over. Because if it sticks in the surf, the next wave stacks up behind it, and the beach turns into a slaughterhouse. By early 1942, the Navy's orders stop being experiments and start being numbers, and the Higgins boat stops being an idea you have to argue for. It becomes the kind of object you can point at on a production schedule, the kind that will soon fill harbors and troop ships, waiting for the day someone, somewhere, will slam a throttle forward and aim it at an enemy shoreline, August 7th, 1942, off Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. The sea is a flat, bruised blue under a hard tropical sun, and an American coxswain in dungarees and a kapok life vest rides the wheel of a small landing craft as it shakes from its own engine and the distant concussion of naval gunfire. In the well, Marines sit hunched with packs between their knees, helmets low, faces already slick with sweat and salt, and when the craft surges forward through chop, you can hear the slap of water on plywood and the clack of rifle metal as men brace for impact. They came down the cargo nets from transports into these little boats because there is no dock, no pier, only reef, sand, and jungle. And the entire gamble is that a boat can do the last few hundred yards reliably enough that the assault doesn't unravel before it even begins. This is what the Marine Corps and the Navy had been chasing in tests back home. A shallow draft carrier that can run up to an open beach and disgorge men fast. And the Higgins lineage is already in the fight. Earlier versions like the landing craft, personnel, large, adapted from his bayou workboats, had been used in the first strikes of this kind, including Guadalcanal and soon North Africa. The coxswain glances at the shoreline, dark green rising sharply, a thin pale strip where surf breaks, and he can't tell yet if the enemy has eyes on them. Then the crack of small arms starts to skip across the water like stones, sharp and sudden, and the Marines tighten, some swearing without sound, others staring straight ahead as if willpower alone can cut a path through the incoming fire. The boat noses in, engine note changing as the prop bites shallower water, and that ugly practical hull shape, born for marshes, does what it was built to do. It keeps moving where deeper draft boats would bog down. Men clench on straps. A sergeant barks for spacing. A machine gunner checks the feed on a Browning like it's a rosary. The landing is messy, violent, immediate. Boots hit surf, then sand, then brush. Yet the rhythm is there, a repeated motion that can be practiced and improved, and back across the ocean in New Orleans the yards keep spitting out more boats, as if the campaign itself is pulling them from the assembly lines by the bow. 3 months later the same logic will be demanded on a far different coast. November 8th, 1942, French North Africa, where the Allied invasion of Morocco and Algeria, Operation Torch, turns the Atlantic into a staging ground and assault troops cram into landing craft beneath the looming sides of troop ships, flags pinned to sleeves, the sea colder, the horizon full of uncertainty not only from enemy fire, but from the possibility of Vichy resistance. In those waters, too, the crucial problem is identical: how to put organized waves of men and equipment onto a hostile shore without a port, before defenders can recover. And every successful run, every boat that touches sand, unloads, backs off, and goes again, feeds a ruthless realization in planners' minds. The war can be fought by choosing beaches, not waiting for harbors. This is where Higgins' miracle stops being a factory story and becomes an operational one, because the boats are not just being built, they're being consumed day by day in salt water and machine gun fire, and the demand for more only grows as the Allies begin to plan landings on a scale that will require tens of thousands of repetitions of the same terrifying final approach. July 1943, New Orleans. Heat shimmers above the pavement and the air inside Higgins Industries is a living thing, heavy with sawdust, hot metal, paint, and diesel, where rivet guns chatter in long bursts like distant machine gun fire, and the whole place runs on shift whistles and urgency. A foreman walks the line with a clipboard, calling out hull numbers as if they're rifle serials, and a young woman in coveralls, hair tucked under a scarf, sleeves rolled high, leans into a jig and drills clean holes through plywood that will soon be the side of an LCVP, the kind of plywood chosen not because it's pretty, but because it's light, fast to work, and doesn't steal steel away from tanks and ships. Higgins himself stalks the floor in his shirt sleeves, a cigarette pinched tight, eyes jumping from ramp hinge to propeller tunnel to engine mount, because the miracle isn't a single clever boat anymore. It's repetition at industrial speed. The same ramp dropping cleanly, the same shallow hole taking shape again and again, until the plant feels less like a boatyard and more like a weapons system. By this point, the workforce has exploded. Tens of thousands by 1943 across multiple facilities, and the war has forced a social fact into physical reality. Men and women, black and white, old hands and brand new workers, all standing at the same benches because the output doesn't care what a city used to be. The boats are needed now, and Higgins's yards become a rare integrated industrial space in New Orleans, held together by pay scales, job ratings, and the simple rule that a ramp that sticks can get a platoon killed. On a near-finished craft, the steel bow ramp is tested, down, up, down, until the hinge pins shine from use. The semi-tunnel in the hull that protects the propeller is checked by hand, fingers tracing the curve that keeps sand and debris from chewing the screw to pieces in the surf. And an engine, often the grey marine diesel that gives the boat its stubborn heartbeat, is bolted in with a mechanic's speed that looks almost casual until you realize he's done it hundreds of times. Outside, in the river air, completed LCVPs sit lined up like blunt-nosed insects awaiting shipment, and the numbers have become so big they sound unreal. More than 23,000 built during the war, with Higgins Industries producing a huge share and other firms building under license. An armada of small craft that will never get the glamour of a battleship, but will decide whether battleships matter. In a corner office, a Navy inspector signs off on another batch. In a break area, a welder wipes sweat from his eyes and mutters that the boats are going everywhere. Africa, Sicily, the Pacific atolls. And he's right. Even as Allied troops fight their way up the beaches of Sicily this month, planners in England are already drawing lines on maps for something far larger, something that will require not dozens of beach landings, but thousands in a single morning, wave after wave, across a shoreline turned into a fortress. The factory's noise is the soundtrack of that coming day, because every hole that slides down the ways is one more doorway that can open onto hostile sand. And the men who will ride those doorways are training right now, climbing down cargo nets into cramped wells, gripping rifles in diesel stink, rehearsing the moment the ramp slams down and the world outside turns lethal. May 12, 1944, Portsmouth. Under a lid of low cloud and drizzle that turns every cobblestone slick, an Allied logistics officer in a rumpled khaki jacket stands on a quay with a clipboard dampening in his hands, staring at rows of squat, blunt-nosed landing craft bobbing against their moorings like impatient animals. The harbour is crowded with the machinery of an invasion. LSTS and transports, cranes, pallets of ammunition under tarps, the smell of rope, diesel, and wet paint. And yet, what he keeps counting, again and again, are the small boats, because the plan doesn't live or die on battleships alone. It lives or dies on whether enough doorways exist to spill men and vehicles onto hostile sand fast enough to survive the first hour. Beside him, a Royal Navy petty officer points down the line with a cigarette and calls out numbers as if they're tide marks. This lot's for Utah, those for Omaha. And the American officer doesn't correct him, even when the accents clash because the work is universal, inventory, allocation, timing. He knows what these craft are in human terms. 36 combat-loaded troops crouched inside, or a jeep and a dozen men, or thousands of pounds of cargo that has to reach the beach whether the sea is calm or furious. A coxswain climbs into one of the boats, LCVP, landing craft, vehicle, personnel, and checks the throttle linkage, then the ramp cable, then the hinge pins, because the ramp is everything. Without it, men have to climb over the sides under fire, and that single delay turns an orderly wave into a pile-up in the surf. Back home in New Orleans, Higgins' yards have been producing these boats by the thousands, but here in England, they are suddenly scarce, in the way bullets are scarce right before a firefight. Plenty on paper, precious in the moment, each hull assigned to a schedule measured in minutes. The officer hears the practice runs even before he sees them, engines coughing to life, then settling into a steady growl as the craft pull away from the pier and form up in lines that stretch out toward grey water. Men in life vests rehearse hand signals. A ramp slams down with a heavy metallic clap and splashes into the harbour, then rises again, tested until it moves like muscle memory. The boats have to be loaded, unloaded, refueled, repaired, and loaded again, because Overlord is not one landing, it is a conveyor belt of landings, wave after wave, and the ocean is the belt. On the quay, a sergeant from an infantry division, helmet chin strap loose, collar turned up, watches the LCVP's low sides and mutters to a buddy that it looks like a coffin with an engine. The buddy answers flatly, "Better than swimming." Somewhere above them, in offices that smell of damp paper and tobacco, planners argue about the last mile math. How many craft per beach? How many trips per tide? How many can be spared if some are smashed on obstacles or torn open by shellfire? And the only honest answer is that they will lose boats, and they will need enough boats left to keep the beachhead alive anyway. When the officer finally writes the number in the margin, roughly 1,500 Higgins boats slated to see action on D-Day, he underlines it twice, not because it's impressive, but because it's terrifying. 1,500 separate approaches to a defended shoreline, 1,500 ramps that must drop cleanly, 1,500 chances for the sea to turn, for an engine to fail, for a machine gun to find the open top at the wrong second. And as the harbour lights flicker on in the wet twilight, the boats keep practicing, out, in, ramp down, ramp up, until the sound becomes a rhythm that follows men into sleep, like a promise and a warning at the same time. June 5th, 1944, the south coast of England. Late evening, and the harbours that were busy in daylight now feel like sealed rooms, lights hooded, orders whispered, engines kept low, because the invasion has finally stopped being a plan and started becoming motion. In the blacked-out lanes near the docks, columns of soldiers move like a slow river, boots scuffing, packs creaking, rifles slung, every man carrying a private weight of letters, photographs, lucky charms, and the hard fact that the next beach will not be friendly. Offshore, transports and attack ships sit heavy in the water, and hanging from their davits, like dark cradles waiting to be filled, are the small craft that will do the last leg, the LCVPs, each one a box of plywood and steel with a ramp that turns terror into a doorway. On the dock, a coxswain checks his craft by touch because there's no light to spare. He runs his hand along the ramp cable, taps the hinge pin, reaches down to the engine hatch, and listens as the mechanic turns it over. One cough, then a steadier rumble, diesel exhaust drifting across the water like a low fog. Nearby, a Navy officer reads the weather reports with a face that doesn't change, because the sea is the one enemy they can't shoot. The original assault date had been June 5th, but the channel's wind and waves had forced a delay, and now, after a narrow break in the forecast, everything is committed to the morning of June 6th, the kind of decision that pulls tens of thousands of men forward, whether they feel ready or not. You can hear the invasion before you see it. The deep, slow churn of big ship screws, the clink of chains, the muffled shouts of loading parties, the steady slap of water against hulls. Marines once rehearsed ramps on Pontchartrain. Tonight, infantrymen and engineers rehearse them in their heads as they climb down nets into the waiting craft, each man stepping carefully so he doesn't kick the helmet of the man below, each one dropping into the cramped well and finding a place on the benches, knees jammed against packs, weapons held upright to keep them out of the bilge water. The coxswain counts bodies with a quick glance, 36, give or take, then turns to the bow and watches the dark horizon where France exists as an idea more than a coastline. The channel crossing is not cinematic in the way people later imagine. It is cold, wet, and punishing, with a sea that makes small boats behave like toys, slamming down and rising again until men go grey with seasickness, vomiting into the water between their boots, wiping mouths with trembling hands, trying to keep rifles dry while waves break over the low sides. The coxswain keeps the engine steady because too much throttle pounds the hull, too little lets the sea shove you sideways, and around him, the armada stretches into darkness. Navigation lights shaded, silhouettes moving in disciplined lanes, the distant thunder of naval guns starting to roll like a storm as bombardment ships open up on the French coast. Somewhere far ahead, minesweepers feel their way through the night. Somewhere behind, more waves form up, and the timing becomes a living thing measured in minutes and tides. As the first grey of dawn creeps into the sky on June 6th, the boats begin to see what they were heading toward. A faint line of land, then flashes on the bluffs, then the sharp, ugly geometry of obstacles in the surf. The coxswain's mouth is dry, the infantryman's fingers are numb around his rifle stock, and the ramp, tested 1,000 times in training and 1,000 more in factories, waits at the bow like a clenched jaw, because in a few moments it will slam down, and everything inside this craft will be thrown forward into history, whether it wants to be or not. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. Just after first light, the channel is a sheet of grey broken by smoke and spray, and an LCVP rides low as it pushes toward the surf line, its bow rising and falling like a stubborn animal trying to climb a wall. Inside, a lieutenant from the 1st Infantry Division, helmet rim low, face tight, tries to read the shoreline through the haze, but the coast is a blur of sand, seawall, and dark high ground. And then the blur turns into muzzle flashes, as German MG-42s stitch the water with precise, terrifying speed. The coxswain yells something, but the words vanish in engine roar and incoming fire. The engineer's hand stays on the throttle anyway, because stopping here is death, and turning back is death, and the only thin slice of survival is forward. A round snaps into the craft and splinters plywood. Another pings off steel with a sound like a hammer blow. Men flinch without moving, because there's nowhere to go inside a landing craft, no cover except the bodies around you. And the lieutenant feels the sick clarity of the design. It is not meant to protect you, it is meant to deliver you, and delivery has a deadline measured in seconds. The boat enters the shallows and begins to skim. The semi-tunnel hull and shallow draft that Higgins perfected for mud and marsh now matter more than any speech in Washington, because the craft can get closer, and closer means fewer yards of chest-deep water under fire. The coxswain sees obstacles, check hedgehogs, stakes, mined ramps, and tries to thread a path, the prop churning sand, the engine note changing as the bottom rises. The lieutenant braces, jaw clenched, as if his teeth can hold the boat together. The impact comes, sand grinding under the hull, and for a heartbeat everything is still except the gunfire. And then the bowman hauls the release, and the ramp slams down with a brutal clang, steel meeting sand, and the world outside detonates into noise. The first men sprint, and one disappears as if yanked backward by an invisible hand. Another falls onto the ramp and the line behind him bunches, boots slipping on wet metal. Someone screams for medics. Someone else is already dragging a wounded man by the straps of his pack, trying to clear the doorway because the boat must empty, or it becomes a killing pen. You, watching through the lieutenant's eyes, feel the horrible compression of time. The ramp is down, and the beach is demanding bodies now. And if you hesitate, you're still in the craft when the next burst rips through the open top. Men leap into water that looks shallow until they hit it and realize it's deep enough to swallow them with their packs. Rifles lift overhead. Waves knock them sideways. The surf turns pink around boots. The lieutenant steps off last, not because he's brave, but because he's trapped by his role. And when his feet hit the bottom, the cold punches through his leggings as bullets whip the surface into sharp little geysers. Behind him, the coxswain reverses hard, ramp up, engine straining, trying to pull away before a shell or a mine can find the craft. Because this boat is not done. It has to live to bring the next wave, and the next, and the next. Other LCVPs grind into sand along the line, ramps dropping in a brutal cadence, each one disgorging men into a storm of fire. and above the beach the bluff guns and machine gun nests keep firing as if they can kill the tide itself. For minutes that feel like hours, the outcome of the largest invasion in history depends on whether thousands of small, fragile craft can keep forcing open a path, delivering human will to a place designed to reject it. And as the lieutenant crawls behind a steel obstacle, breathing sand and cordite, he realizes with a strange, bitter gratitude that he is alive on the beach at all. Alive because a boat built in New Orleans could run shallow, drop a ramp, and turn the ocean into a road. June 6th into June 7th, 1944, Normandy. The first assault waves have shattered on the sand and crawled forward into whatever cover exists. But the real test now is brutal and unromantic. Can the beachhead be fed faster than it bleeds? Can ammunition, radios, engineers, wire, medical gear, and vehicles keep arriving, while the enemy still fires down from the high ground? And can the wounded be pulled back across the same water that just delivered the living? An LCVP noses in again under a different sky. Smoke thicker now, the smell of burning cordite and fuel hanging low. Its hull already scraped raw from sand and obstacles, its paint chipped, its plywood scarred with splinters. The coxswain has been running since dawn, and his eyes are rimmed red from salt and exhaustion, but his hands still find the wheel and throttle with the same practiced precision because the job has turned into a loop. Load at the mothership, run in, ramp down, unload, ramp up, back out, repeat until the engine dies or the tide changes. On the well deck this time there's cargo. Crates of .30-06 ammunition, coils of communication wire, a box marked plasma, and a litter team crouched over a wounded man whose face is the color of ash. The craft is both supply truck and ambulance, because in an amphibious landing everything must do double duty. Offshore, larger ships wait in lanes, and you can see why the Higgins boat became a workhorse. Its size is small enough to handle close-in surf and shallow water, but large enough to move meaningful loads and squads quickly, and in a battle where minutes decide whether a foothold becomes a breakthrough, that middle ground is priceless. The coxswain aims for a gap between obstacles, some broken now, some still lethal, and as he approaches, a shell lands somewhere down the beach and throws up a plume of sand and smoke. The boat shudders, men flinch, but the run continues because the shoreline is no longer just a line to be crossed. It's a living logistics point that has to function under fire. The ramp drops, and engineers rush out with Bangalore torpedoes and wire cutters, their faces set in the hard focus of men who know they're racing machine guns. A jeep lurches down the ramp, tires spinning in wet sand, then catches and crawls forward. Medics move the wounded carefully onto the ramp and into the craft's belly for the trip back to the ships where surgeons work under red lights and relentless pressure. Nearby, another LCVP backs off too late and grinds sideways in the surf. A crewman jumps out waist deep to shove the stern free, muscles straining, while rounds snap overhead. The boat finally swings, engines snarling, and pulls away, because every hull that stays functional is one more artery feeding the invasion. Throughout the night, the pattern continues in cold darkness broken by tracers and flares, boats moving like shadows, ramps clanging down onto sand, engines coughing, crews yelling into wind and smoke. In some sectors, the seas roughen and the unloading becomes chaos. But even chaos can be managed if enough craft exist to keep the flow going. And that is where Higgins' production miracle reveals its true power. Not in a single heroic landing, but in the fact that the door can open again and again until the shoreline stops being enemy territory and becomes, in a grim, makeshift way, Allied ground. By June 7th, the beachheads Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword are stitched together by this constant motion of men and material. And though the fighting inland remains savage, the invasion does not collapse back into the sea, because the sea has been turned into a supply route by thousands of small craft that can do what few things in war can, make the impossible repeatable. August 15th, 1945, New Orleans. The summer air sits thick over the city and the river moves with its old, indifferent patience. But inside Higgins Industries, the noise that once never stopped has thinned into something almost unfamiliar, because the war that devoured boats and men has reached its last page. News of Japan's surrender crackles through radios and mouths, and workers stand in clusters near open doors, some cheering, some simply staring as if their bodies don't yet trust the word over. In one of the yards, unfinished hulls rest on blocks like paused sentences, and a foreman runs his hand along a bow ramp hinge, feeling the cold metal and remembering the sound it made. Clang, splash, rise, thousands of times, a sound that once meant more output, more urgency, more lives depending on a mechanism. Andrew Higgins is older now, worn down in ways that don't show in photographs, and he watches the plant with a complicated look, pride, exhaustion, and the hard knowledge that his miracle was never magic. It was sweat and schedules and arguments with Navy men and the relentless discipline of making one boat, then making it again, then making it 23,000 times until the world's shorelines changed. During the war, the LCVP became a common sight in every major amphibious theater, from the Mediterranean landings to the island fights across the Pacific, and that quiet ubiquity is the true mark of its importance. It became so normal that people stopped noticing how radical it was to turn open beaches into viable invasion routes. In Washington and in memoirs, senior commanders and historians would later point at the same underlying truth, that amphibious warfare at Allied scale required an industrial answer, and Higgins provided one. Dwight D. Eisenhower himself would later praise Higgins as the man who won the war for us, a line that sounds like exaggeration until you picture Normandy again, not as a single cinematic moment, but as a logistics problem solved by thousands of ramps dropping on cue. Yet the legacy isn't only strategic, it's human and local, written into the city's memory and the lives of the people who built the craft. Women who had never held industrial jobs learned to read blueprints and drill precise holes. Black workers gained access to skilled positions in an integrated wartime workplace, rare for its time. Immigrant machinists and Gulf Coast boatmen stood shoulder to shoulder, each one contributing to an output that became a weapon in itself. Outside the gates, the world will move on to peacetime arguments, to new tensions, to different wars and different technologies, but the basic geometry of amphibious assault has been altered permanently. If you can mass-produce shallow draft craft with reliable ramps, you can write plans that assume the ocean can be crossed not only by ships, but by waves of small vehicles that turn water into a roadway. Higgins's own later years will not be simple. Few wartime industrial legends have clean endings, but the boats remain, in museums and photographs and rusting remnants, as proof of a hard American kind of ingenuity. Not elegant, not romantic, but practical enough to work under fire. And if you return in your mind to Omaha at first light, to that moment the ramp hits sand and men surge forward into smoke, you understand what the Higgins boat miracle really was. A New Orleans builder took the logic of bayou workboats, married it to a ramp that solved the deadliest seconds of landing, and, most decisively, built it at a scale that let the Allies keep opening that door until the beachhead held. The miracle wasn't that one boat could touch hostile sand, it was that thousands could do it, again and again, until the map of the war changed.